that cold and colorless home, where faith was used to wound and not to warn.
Her name is Louise Carter, and for 66 years she carried a secret so heavy it nearly destroyed her. She grew up in Holland, Michigan, a small town where tulips bloom in spring and secrets rot in summer. At 15, her life was stolen by a man everyone revered as a saint. He called her chosen, but Louise knew she was just another victim on his list. Today, at 81, Louise has decided to tell the truth, not for herself, but for all the girls who came before her and for those who can still be saved, in Holland, in Michigan, in the world. This is a story of pain, courage, and liberation. And if you stay with her until the end, you'll surely understand what it means to fight against darkness and win. But beware, this story is not for the weak. Are you ready to hear the truth? Please subscribe to the channel to always have access to emotional stories filled with truths and teachings. Holland, Michigan is the kind of town that looks like it came from a postcard. Houses with impeccable gardens, quiet streets, and of course the famous Tulip Time Festival that attracts tourists from all corners. But like any small town, Holland has its secrets, and the biggest one lived in the shadow of the First Baptist Church, where the bell rang every Sunday, calling the faithful to worship. Louise was just a girl when it all began. Her family, the Carters, was known for their devotion. Her father, Joseph, was a man of few words, but his faith was unshakable. Her mother, Martha, was the heart of the home, always singing hymns while cooking or sewing. They believed the church was the center of their lives, and the pastor, Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell, was the man closest to God they knew. She remembers the first time she saw him. He had a presence that dominated the room. He wasn't tall, but his voice was deep and resonated like the church organ. When he preached, it was as if he was speaking directly to each person, unraveling their deepest secrets. People adored him. They said he had a direct connection to the divine. But for Louise, he was the beginning of her nightmare. It all started on a summer night when a storm swept through Holland. The wind howled through the trees, and rain beat against the windows as if wanting to enter. The family was all gathered in the living room, trying to ignore the sound of thunder when someone knocked at the door. Her father opened it, and there he was, Reverend Caldwell, with his rain-soaked cape and a look that seemed to pierce the soul. He said he had come with a message from God, that he had had a dream, a vision, and that Louise was special, that she had been chosen for a divine mission. Her parents were ecstatic. For them, it was the greatest honor a family could receive. But for Louise, those words sounded like a sentence. That night, while the Reverend spoke about her mission, Louise felt something inside her break. She was just a 15-year-old girl, and her life, which until then had been simple and peaceful, was about to change forever. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. The look in her parents' eyes, full of pride and reverence, kept her trapped. They believed they were delivering her to God, but deep down, Louise knew they were delivering her to him. And that's how it began. A story that Holland never wanted to hear. A story that Louise kept for decades, until now, because some truths are too heavy to carry alone. The invisible cage. After that night, Louise's life changed in ways she could never have imagined. What had once been a simple and predictable routine, helping her mother in the kitchen, studying and dreaming about the future, transformed into something she could barely recognize. Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell began coming to the Carter house frequently, always with that paternal smile and calm voice that made even the most skeptical believe his words. He said he was there to prepare her for her divine mission. Her parents, Joseph and Martha, were radiant. For them, Louise was chosen, a living blessing. But for her, each visit from the Reverend was like a weight accumulating in her chest. He spoke of purity, sacrifice, and obedience, words that seemed so distant from anything she could understand at 15. One afternoon, he asked to speak with Louise alone. Her mother, with a proud smile, left her with him in the living room. Louise sat on the sofa, hands clasped in her lap, while he occupied her father's armchair as if he owned the house. He began talking about her spirituality, about how she was special, different from other girls her age. Each word seemed like a noose tightening around Louise. "You understand, Louise," he said, leaning forward, "that God has a greater plan for you, a plan that goes beyond what any of us can comprehend." Louise didn't know what to answer. She just nodded, trying to ignore the chill running up her spine. He smiled, satisfied with her silence, and placed his hand over hers. His hand was warm, but not in a comforting way. It was a heat that burned, that made Louise's skin crawl. "You have been chosen," he continued, squeezing her hand lightly, "and that is a great responsibility. But don't worry, I'll be here to guide you." That night, as Louise lay in her bed, his words echoed in her mind. She wanted to believe it was a bad dream, that everything would return to normal in the morning. But deep down, Louise knew her life would never be the same again. The spiritual marriage. The news spread quickly through the Holland community. Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell announced during Sunday service that God had given him a vision. He said that Louise Carter had been chosen to be his spiritual wife. His words echoed through the church, and Louise felt all eyes turned to her. Some were admiring, others envious, but no one seemed to see the terror in her eyes. Her parents sat beside her with smiles so wide they seemed painful. Her mother held her hand tightly, as if wanting to transmit her joy, but all Louise felt was a growing emptiness inside her. The ceremony was scheduled for the following week on a Thursday afternoon. It wouldn't be a common wedding, he explained. There would be no party, no guests, just a small ceremony in the church meeting room. "It's something sacred, intimate," he said, looking directly at Louise. "Something that only we and God can understand." Her mother sewed a simple white dress for Louise. While working, she sang hymns of praise, her hands moving with a precision that only love could provide. But for Louise, each stitch of the needle was like a stab to the heart. She wanted to scream, to beg her mother to stop, but she couldn't. The pride in her parents' eyes was so great that she knew her words would be useless. On the day of the ceremony, Louise looked at herself in the mirror wearing the white dress. The girl staring back seemed like a stranger. Her eyes were empty, her expression resigned. She knew that from that moment on, her life would no longer be her own. The ceremony was quick. The Reverend recited Bible passages that Louise had never heard before, speaking about obedience and sacrifice. He held her hand while saying the words that would unite them spiritually. Her mother cried with emotion, and her father nodded, as if witnessing a miracle. When it was all over, he placed his hand on Louise's shoulder and said, "Now you belong to God, Louise, and as your spiritual guide, I will take care of you." That night, as Louise lay in the small room he had prepared for her in the parsonage, she felt the weight of everything that had happened. She was no longer Louise Carter, daughter of Joseph and Martha. She was the spiritual wife of Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell, and for the first time, she realized she was completely alone. The silent prison. Life in the parsonage was a silent prison for Louise. Her room, or rather the small room that Reverend Caldwell called the annex, was cold and damp. There was a narrow bed with a mattress that squeaked with every movement, a window that faced a brick wall covered with dead ivy, and a Bible open to Psalm 23, as if that could comfort her. But there was no comfort there. Only the sound of Michigan's cold wind outside and the echo of the Reverend's heavy footsteps through the wooden corridors that creaked under his weight, a macabre symphony that marked the rhythm of her days and nights. During the day, Louise helped Mrs. Caldwell with household chores. Mrs. Caldwell was a small, frail woman with graying hair always pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to have lost all their brightness long ago. She spoke little, only what was necessary. "Louise, go get firewood. Louise, prepare the tea. Louise, the Reverend wants to see you in the office." Her words came out as whispers, as if she was afraid someone might hear her, or perhaps that the truth itself might materialize in the air. Louise observed how Mrs. Caldwell avoided her gaze, the way her shoulders curved under an invisible burden. There was a deep and resigned sadness in her, one that Louise was beginning to understand. Louise realized that Mrs. Caldwell knew. She saw it in her eyes when the Reverend called her for spiritual conversations that lasted hours, closed doors and muffled voices. She saw it in the way Mrs. Caldwell looked away when Louise returned, always with red eyes and trembling hands, her soul emptied. Once, when Louise was washing dishes in the kitchen, Mrs. Caldwell approached, her wrinkled hands hesitating before touching Louise's arm. "I'm sorry, dear. I'm truly sorry," she whispered, her words almost inaudible, but laden with a weight that Louise felt in the pit of her stomach. Those words hit her like a punch because they confirmed what she already knew. Mrs. Caldwell knew everything and for some reason did nothing. This knowledge was a new layer of pain, a burden shared in silence. The spiritual conversations with the Reverend always happened in the late afternoon, when shadows began to lengthen through the house and wind howled through poorly sealed windows, like a lament. He called her to his office, a place that smelled of old tobacco and moldy paper, an aroma that Louise would forever associate with fear. The walls were covered with theological books, framed diplomas, and a large dark wooden cross that seemed to watch her with invisible, judging eyes. "Louise," he would say with that honeyed voice that made her feel nauseous, "you understand the privilege of being here, don't you? God has special plans for you." And then the ritual would begin. He would open the Bible to specific passages, always the same ones, about obedience, about serving God, about the importance of accepting divine will without question. "The woman must submit to man as the church submits to Christ," he would recite, his eyes fixed on Louise with an intensity that made her want to disappear, to vanish into the thin air of that room. "Do you understand this, Louise? Do you understand that your salvation depends on your obedience?" Louise would nod, because that's what he wanted to hear, because disagreeing meant punishment, because questioning meant being locked in the dark basement of the parsonage, where rats ran between dusty boxes and the smell of mold was so strong she could barely breathe, a punishment that left her trembling and with a dry throat for hours. With each conversation, a part of her soul seemed to be torn away, replaced by a growing emptiness. The nights were the worst, when the house fell silent and Louise heard the Reverend's heavy footsteps through the corridors. Her heart would race, beating like a drum in her chest. She would pull the thin blanket over her head and pretend to sleep, but her ears were always alert, every muscle tense. Sometimes he would walk straight past her room and Louise would let out a silent sigh of relief. Other times, the doorknob would turn slowly and he would enter. "Don't be afraid, Louise," he would whisper in the darkness, his voice a serpent sliding through the air. "This is part of your spiritual training. God is testing your faith through me." His hands were cold and rough, and Louise would close her eyes tightly, transporting her mind far from there, to her mother's garden, where tulips bloomed in spring, a refuge of colors and fragrance, to the warm kitchen of her home, where the smell of apple pie lingered in the air, a reminder of lost innocence, to anywhere that wasn't that cold room and those hands that hurt her, that robbed her of herself. During the day, Louise tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy. She smiled when necessary, answered questions with the submission he expected, participated in morning and evening prayers with an empty voice. But inside, something was dying. Her faith, which had once been genuine and innocent, was turning to ashes, to silent despair. How could a loving God allow this? How could her parents, who said they loved her, have delivered her to that monster, blinded by faith and reverence? The only thing that kept her minimally sane were the letters she secretly wrote to her younger sister, Sarah. She never sent them, of course, as there was no way to, but writing was a way to keep alive the hope that one day she could tell the truth to someone, that her voice wouldn't be completely silenced. Louise hid the papers inside the Bible, between the pages of the book of Job, because that story of unjust suffering seemed to be the only one that made sense for her life at that moment, a dark echo of her own ordeal. "Dear Sarah," she would write by the faint light of the moon coming through the window, "I hope you never have to go through what I'm going through. I hope you grow up free, that you choose your own path, that you never let anyone tell you that you're worthless. I'm trying to be strong, but some days it's so hard. The darkness here is deep, and hope is a fragile flame, but I hold it with all my strength." The months passed like a dense and suffocating fog. Autumn came with its golden leaves that Louise watched through the window, wishing she could go out and run through them as she did as a child, feeling the freedom of the wind. Winter brought snow that covered Holland like a white blanket, but to her, it seemed more like a shroud, a veil over her existence. And then spring came, and with it, a discovery that would change everything forever, igniting a new and dangerous flame in her heart, the unearthed secret. It was during a spring storm, with thunder that made the old parsonage tremble, that Louise's life took an even darker direction and, paradoxically, a new purpose. The trees swayed violently outside, their slender branches scratching the windows, and the wind howled through the cracks of the old building like tormented souls, a ghostly chorus that seemed to predict what was to come. Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell had left for a church council meeting, and Mrs. Caldwell was resting in her room with one of her frequent migraines, leaving Louise in rare and precious solitude. It was in these rare moments of solitude that Louise could breathe a little more freely, feeling the air in her lungs without the oppressive weight of constant surveillance. She was in the Reverend's office, cleaning the shelves as he had instructed, her mind wandering among the dusty pages of theology books, when a particularly strong thunderclap made the entire house shake on its foundations. The noise was so intense that one of the heavy books, a leather-bound tome that seemed never to have been touched, fell from the highest shelf, landing on the floor with a dull and resonant thud. When Louise bent down to pick it up, her eyes, trained by forced observation, noticed something unusual. One of the floorboards had come loose slightly with the impact, revealing a dark crack. Her curiosity, which had been suppressed for so long, awakened like a hungry flame, a spark of rebellion in her heart. She looked around to make sure she was alone, the silence of the house broken only by the sound of falling rain. Carefully, with hands trembling from anticipation and fear, she lifted the loose board. Underneath, there was a hollow space, a secret hiding place, and inside it, a small, rusted metal box, like a dark treasure waiting to be discovered. Her hands trembled even more when she opened the box, the cold metal against her fingers. Inside, Louise found something that would forever change her understanding of the man who had made her life hell. A black leather notebook, worn by time, its pages yellowed and stained, and several old, faded photographs. The notebook was filled with the Reverend's meticulous handwriting, small and precise letters that contrasted with the monstrosity of the content. The first pages contained what appeared to be personal confessions, theological musings, but as Louise read, an icy chill ran up her spine. She realized they were actually detailed records of his sessions with different young women over the years. Names she recognized, girls from the congregation who had moved suddenly or who had found opportunities in other cities, and that Louise now knew were euphemisms for something much more sinister. Rebecca Morrison, 16 years old, resistant at first, but responded well to intensive biblical training, left for missionary work after 6 months. Jennifer Walsh, 15 years old, very docile, excellent spiritual progress, sent for religious studies in Grand Rapids. Susan Richards, 17 years old, problematic, tried to escape twice, required rigorous discipline, sent for permanent spiritual retreat. Page after page of names, ages, clinical descriptions of abuse presented as spiritual development, a distorted language that made her feel nauseous. Louise's stomach revolted when she read her own name on the most recent list. Louise Carter, 16 years old, very promising, extremely cooperative parents, training in progress. The date next to her name made her freeze. It was from just a few weeks before, indicating she was being monitored and categorized like the others. The photographs were even more disturbing. Images of young girls in simple clothes, all with the same empty expression in their eyes that Louise recognized in the mirror, a reflection of her own pain. Some she knew from church, others were unknown faces, but the pain in their eyes was universal. They all looked lost, broken, like dolls that had all life sucked out of them, transformed into empty shells. But it was the last entry in the notebook that made her freeze completely. It was dated just 2 weeks before. Louise is progressing as expected. Parents have shown satisfaction with reports of her spiritual development, planning program expansion. The new youth counselor, Pastor Mitchell, has shown interest in similar methods. Meetings scheduled to discuss implementation in his parish in Kalamazoo. God's work must continue. Louise understood at that moment that she was not the first, nor would she be the last. Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell had turned this into a system, a network of abuse that extended far beyond Holland. And worse still, other men were involved, other servants of God who saw young girls not as precious daughters of their congregations, but as objects for their sick desires, a web of evil that was spreading. Her hands trembled so much she almost dropped the notebook, the cold and heavy leather in her fingers. She closed her eyes and tried to breathe, but the air seemed to have become thinner, suffocating. For a moment, Louise considered taking that notebook and running directly to the police station to expose everything. But then she remembered the Reverend's words about how no one would believe her against a respected man of God, a pillar of the community. She remembered how her own parents had chosen to believe him instead of her, a betrayal that still hurt her deeply. Carefully, Louise put everything back in the box and hid it again under the loose board, feeling the weight of evidence in her hands. She arranged the books on the shelf, cleaned any evidence that she had touched anything, and returned to her room with her mind boiling, a whirlwind of anger, fear, and a new and dangerous determination. That night, Louise couldn't sleep. She lay looking at the cracked ceiling of her room, processing everything she had discovered. The anger she had tried to suppress for so long began to boil inside her like volcanic lava, an intense heat that consumed her. It wasn't just about her. It was about Rebecca, Jennifer, Susan, and all the other girls whose names were in that notebook. It was about Pastor Mitchell's future victims in Kalamazoo. It was about an entire system of men who used God's word to justify the cruelest evil, a blasphemy that revolted her. It was that night that Louise made a decision that would change the course of everything. She would no longer be just a silent victim. She would not allow other girls to go through what she was going through. But she needed to be smart. She needed a foolproof plan because she would only have one chance, and that chance was all she had. The next day, Louise began observing everything with different eyes, with an acuity sharpened by danger. The Reverend's schedules, the moments when he left the house, where he kept the keys to his office. She began paying attention to the conversations he had on the phone, especially those that mentioned new candidates for spiritual guidance, words that now sounded like macabre codes. Mrs. Caldwell also began to seem different to her. Louise had thought of her as another victim, a broken woman who didn't have the strength to act. But now she wondered, was Mrs. Caldwell an accomplice? Did she know about the notebook? Did she help choose the next victims? Doubt gnawed at Louise, adding another layer of distrust to her already distorted world. One morning, while they were preparing breakfast together, Louise decided to test her suspicions. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said casually, her voice firmer than expected, "what happened to Rebecca Morrison? She used to come to church every Sunday, but suddenly disappeared." Mrs. Caldwell froze for a moment, her hand frozen on the handle of the pot she was stirring, silence filling the kitchen. When she turned to Louise, her eyes were full of tears, an old and deep pain reflected in them. "Some questions are better left unanswered, Louise," she whispered, her voice choked. "Some truths are too heavy to carry." At that moment, Louise knew that Mrs. Caldwell knew everything, and Louise knew that she had chosen silence instead of protecting innocent girls. The anger inside Louise grew even more, mixing with bitter compassion for the woman who also lived in her own prison. The network of blood. What Louise discovered in that notebook kept her awake for 3 straight nights, her mind a whirlwind of names and images. They weren't just names, they were destroyed lives, murdered dreams, souls broken by the same machine that now imprisoned her. Sarah Thompson, 16 years old, transferred to relatives' house in Detroit. Mary Lou Henderson, 15 years old, sent for spiritual treatment in Chicago. Jennifer Walsh, 17 years old, placed under special care in Grand Rapids. Each annotation was a blow, a confirmation of the vast web of darkness that Reverend Caldwell had woven. But Louise knew the truth behind these clinical annotations, these cruel euphemisms. Each of these girls had gone through the same ordeal she was living, and they had all simply disappeared. The question hammered in her mind, where were these girls now? Were they alive? Had they managed to escape, or the fear that the answer was the worst possible consumed her? During the day, Louise pretended normalcy. She swept the church corridors, organized the hymnals, helped Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen when she came to prepare community meals, each movement a mask for the fury and dread that boiled inside her. But her mind seethed with questions. Where were these girls now? Were they alive? Had they managed to escape, or... The answer came in a way she never expected, from a whispered conversation that would change everything. It was a rainy Thursday in October, the gray and heavy sky over Holland, when Mrs. Henderson arrived earlier than usual at the parsonage. Louise was in the kitchen, trying to fix a faucet that dripped incessantly, another of the domestic duties that the Reverend had imposed on her, a monotonous task that kept her busy but not distracted when she heard her talking to someone in the hallway. "She's different, Reverend," murmured Mrs. Henderson's familiar voice, a tone of concern that Louise had never noticed before. Quieter, more observant. The others never stayed like this for so long. "She's older," replied Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell's voice, low and calculating, cold as ice. 16 years old, more mature, more resistant. What if she discovers about Detroit, about what happened to Thompson? Louise's blood froze in her veins. Detroit, Sarah Thompson, the name from the notebook. She pressed herself against the wall, barely able to breathe, her heart beating wildly in her chest. They were talking about her, and about Sarah Thompson. What had happened in Detroit? What was so terrible that Mrs. Henderson could barely pronounce it? "She won't find out." The Reverend's voice was cold as ice, cutting like a blade. "And even if she does, who's going to believe the word of a troubled girl against mine, against our community?" The arrogance in his voice was palpable, the certainty of his impunity. "Reverend," Mrs. Henderson's voice trembled, almost a lament. I don't know if I can continue with this. When I saw that photo in the Grand Rapids newspaper of the Walsh girl." "Shut up!" The Reverend's voice cut like a blade, full of contained fury. "You knew what you were doing when you accepted our money. You knew very well." There was a tense silence, heavy, filled only by the sound of rain. Then Mrs. Henderson murmured, "God forgive me." "God has already forgiven us," replied the Reverend, and Louise could hear the cruel smile in his voice, a perverse satisfaction. "We're saving these girls from sin, giving them a chance at redemption." When their voices moved away, Louise slid down the wall to the floor, trembling uncontrollably, the words echoing in her mind like a nightmare. Jennifer Walsh, Grand Rapids, a photo in the newspaper. The truth, cold and brutal, was beginning to solidify. That night, when the Reverend left for one of his pastoral meetings, Louise now knew they weren't real pastoral meetings, but encounters with his network of accomplices. She snuck into his office again, but this time, she wasn't after the notebook. She was after something more, something that would confirm her worst fears. She searched every drawer, every shelf, every corner of that damned office, her fingers agile and determined. And then, hidden behind a row of biblical commentaries, she found a rusted metal box, larger and heavier than the previous one. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, young girls, all with the same empty expression that Louise had seen in her own eyes in the mirror. But these photos were different, disturbing. They showed the girls in situations that made her gag with horror, a wave of nausea rising in her throat. And underneath the photos, newspaper clippings. Holland teenager found dead in Detroit. 15-year-old girl disappears after leaving home in Grand Rapids. Teenager's body identified after 3 months. Sarah Thompson, Jennifer Walsh, Mary Lou Henderson, all dead, all murdered. The realization fell with crushing weight. Louise was not the first, and if she didn't do something, she wouldn't be the last. The anger, once aflame, was now an inferno in her chest. With trembling hands, but with new determination, Louise photographed everything with an old Polaroid camera she found in one of the drawers. Every photo, every clipping, every page of that damned notebook. The evidence was there, right in front of her, cold and irrefutable. But who would believe? And more importantly, how could she get out of there alive to tell the story? The question haunted her. When she heard the Reverend's car returning, the sound of tires in the house's driveway, Louise put everything back exactly as it was and ran to her room, her heart beating erratically. But lying in that narrow bed, looking at the cracked ceiling, she knew her life had changed again and forever. Louise was not just a victim, she was a witness. And in Holland, Michigan, in the year 1975, that made her a very dangerous person. The game had changed, and she was ready to play. The next morning, Louise knew something had changed. Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell was watching her differently, no longer with that false pastoral benevolence, but with something much more dangerous, suspicion. His eyes, once merely cold, now carried a calculating intensity that made her feel like cornered prey. "Louise," he said during breakfast, his voice laden with artificial sweetness that made her stomach turn. "Have you been sleeping well? You seem worried." The question was a trap, bait to test her reaction. Louise forced a smile, keeping her eyes low as he always demanded, an act of submission that was now a strategy. "Yes, Reverend. Just thinking about the scriptures you asked me to study." Her voice sounded calmer than she expected, a small internal triumph. "Good." He leaned forward, his gray eyes piercing Louise's, searching for any sign of hesitation. "And what scriptures were those exactly?" Louise's heart raced, a hammer in her chest. He was testing her, trying to catch her in a lie. "Psalm 23, Reverend. The Lord is my shepherd." She recited the words with a naturalness that surprised her. "Ah, yes." He leaned back in his chair, but his eyes never left Louise's face, an implacable vigilance. "And what did you learn about obedience?" The word came from his mouth like poison, laden with a dark meaning that Louise knew well. Obedience, the same word he always used before. Before the nights, she tried to erase from her memory, the nights of terror. "I learned that we must trust in God's plan," Louise replied, each word carefully measured, a dangerous dance between truth and dissimulation. "Very good." He rose from the table, but stopped beside Louise, his hand landing on her shoulder with pressure that was both possessive and threatening, a physical reminder of his control. "Because today, we're going to have a very important conversation about trust and about the consequences of excessive curiosity." Louise's blood froze. He knew. Somehow he knew she had discovered his secret. The air in the room seemed to become heavier, dense with threat. The day passed in slow agony. Each task he gave her seemed laden with double meaning. Each look from him a silent interrogation. Clean the office. He stayed watching her every movement, his eyes following her hands. Organize the books. He checked every shelf Louise had touched, looking for any sign of alteration. Sweep the church. He appeared 3 times to check her progress, his presence an oppressive specter. In the afternoon, when the sun began to set, painting Holland's sky a red that reminded her of blood, Reverend Caldwell called Louise to his office. The invitation was a summons, the room, a chamber of psychological torture. "Sit down, Louise." His voice was too calm, too controlled, a prelude to the storm. Louise sat in the chair facing his desk, the same chairs where so many other girls had sat before disappearing forever. Her mind raced to the photos she had seen the night before. Had Sarah Thompson sat in this same chair? Jennifer Walsh? Mary Lou Henderson? The thought made her feel nauseous. "You know," he began, spinning a pen between his fingers, a hypnotic and disturbing movement. "Holland is a small town. People talk, and sometimes things are said that shouldn't be said." Louise remained silent, every fiber of her being screaming for her to run, to flee from that place and that man. "For example," he continued, his eyes now fixed on Louise's, with an intensity that trapped her. "Someone might mention seeing lights in my office at night, when I wasn't home." Louise's heart beat so loudly she was sure he could hear it, the sound of her own betrayal echoing in the room. "Or someone might notice that certain personal properties have been touched, reorganized, touched by hands that shouldn't touch them." He rose slowly, walking around the desk until he stood behind Louise's chair. She could feel his breath on her neck, a shiver of revulsion running through her body. "Do you have something to tell me, Louise?" Every instinct screamed for her to confess, to beg forgiveness, to do anything that might appease his anger and avoid the worst. But then Louise thought of Sarah Thompson, of Jennifer Walsh, of Mary Lou Henderson, of all the girls whose lives had been cut short by that man's cruelty. She couldn't give in. "No, Reverend," Louise replied, her voice firmer than she expected, a small victory amid the terror. "I have nothing to say." The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with tension. Then, slowly, he returned behind the desk and opened the top drawer. Louise's heart almost stopped when she saw what he took out. The Polaroid photographs, the photos she had taken, her photographs. "Interesting," he murmured, spreading the photos on the desk, each one irrefutable proof. "Very interesting. You know, Louise, I always knew you were different from the others, more intelligent, more resourceful." He picked up one of the photos, the one of the notebook with the names, and examined it carefully, a cold and calculating smile playing on his lips. But intelligence, my dear child, can be a curse, especially when it's used inappropriately. Louise's mind raced frantically. How had he found the photos? Where had she gone wrong? Where was the flaw in her plan? As if he could read her thoughts, he smiled, a cold and calculating smile that made Louise's blood freeze in her veins. Did you really think I wouldn't check the camera? That I wouldn't know how many photos were left on the film? He shook his head, with an expression of false disappointment, almost a theatrical lament. Louise, you disappoint me. It was then that Louise understood. The trap had been perfect. He had left the camera there purposely. He had left everything accessible, knowing she would discover it. He wanted her to know. He wanted her to try to document, because that gave him the perfect excuse to. Now, he said, leaning forward with that terrible smile, his eyes shining with cold malice. Let's talk about what happens to girls who are too curious in Holland, Michigan. The office walls seemed to close around Louise, the air thin, the atmosphere oppressive. She was cornered, and they both knew it. But as she looked at that monstrous man, one thing became clear in her mind, a determination that surprised her. Louise would not be just another victim, not if she could help it. You're right, Reverend, Louise said, surprising him with her sudden calm, a serenity that hid fury. I am different from the others, and for the first time since she had arrived at that house of hell, Louise smiled back, a small smile, but laden with defiance and a silent promise that the fight was just beginning. Louise's heart beat so hard, she was sure everyone in the town of Holland could hear it, a frantic drum in her chest. It was 2 a.m. when she finally managed to move. For 3 hours, she lay pretending to sleep, listening to every creak of the house, every sigh from Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell in the next room, every muffled noise from the street, her senses sharpened by fear and adrenaline. The plan she had formed in her mind was simple in essence. Get the evidence, leave the house, and run straight to the police station. But when you're in the middle of a storm, nothing is simple. Each floorboard seemed to scream her name when she stepped on it, a sound amplified by the oppressive silence of the night. Each shadow on the wall seemed to move to betray her, ghosts of her own dread. First, Louise needed to reach the office. The door was locked, but she had observed the Reverend for weeks, memorizing his habits. He kept the key in a small box behind the books on the living room shelf. Her fingers trembled so much, she dropped 2 books before finding the box, the noise echoing through the house like a gunshot. Louise froze for 5 entire minutes, holding her breath, waiting to hear footsteps, the sound of the Reverend's door opening. Silence. Only the irritating tick-tock of the wall clock and her own panting breath, a constant reminder of her precarious existence. When she finally opened the office door, the smell of leather and old paper hit her like a slap, an aroma that was now synonymous with rot. It was like entering the wolf's den, a place of darkness and secrets. The walls were covered with diplomas and certificates that now seemed like masks to her, elaborate disguises to hide the true rot behind the respectable facade. The file was exactly where she had left it. Her fingers moved quickly through the folders, removing the most compromising photographs and pages from the notebook with the victims' names. There were also letters, correspondence between the Reverend and other men in the city, discussing deliveries and special merchandise. Louise's stomach turned as she read those coded words that described girls as if they were cattle, objects without value, without soul. It was when Louise found her own folder. Her name was written in capital letters on the tab, Louise Carter, 16 years old, chosen. Inside were photos of her that she never knew had been taken, notes about her suitability for special work, and what made her almost vomit right there, a note about her market value. They weren't just abusing them, they were selling them. Louise was merchandise, an object, an investment. The dehumanization was complete, cruel. The anger Louise felt at that moment was beyond anything she had ever experienced. It was a visceral, primitive fury that began in the pit of her stomach and spread through her entire body like liquid fire, burning every fiber of her being. Her hands stopped trembling. Her mind became crystalline, focused on a single objective, the destruction of that system. Louise took everything, every paper, every photo, every damned piece of evidence from that disgusting operation. She stuffed everything into a cloth bag she found in the closet, the thin fabric barely containing the weight of truth. She was going to take it straight to the police and watch while they all rotted in jail, a burning desire for justice. But when she turned to leave, he was there. Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell stood in the doorway, in his robe, with an expression that was half sleep, half fury, a terrifying mixture. His eyes moved from the bag in Louise's hands to the open file, and she saw the exact moment he understood what was happening, the truth revealing itself on his face. "Louise," he said, and his voice was strangely calm, a tone that was more threatening than any scream. "What are you doing, my child?" Louise could have lied, could have made up an excuse, could have tried to deceive him, but she was tired of pretending, tired of being a victim, tired of being afraid. The fury that consumed her no longer allowed dissimulation. "I'm ending this," Louise replied, raising the bag, her voice firm and laden with unshakable determination. "I'm ending you." The smile that spread across his face was the most terrible thing Louise had ever seen. It was the smile of a predator who had been challenged by its prey, an expression of pure evil. "You don't understand the situation, Louise. You don't understand who is protecting this holy work." He took a step into the office, closing the door behind him, sealing Louise's fate. "Sheriff Johnson is a very devout man. Judge McCarty has attended our church for 20 years. Mayor Wilson, well, let's say he has personal interest in keeping certain things secret." Louise's blood froze. He was telling her that the corruption went beyond him, that the entire town of Holland was involved, a web of complicity that extended throughout the community. "Even if you manage to get out of here," he continued, approaching slowly, his steps heavy and threatening. "Even if you reach the police station, who do you think would believe? A disturbed orphan against respected pillars of the community?" He was right, and they both knew it. Truth was a powerful weapon, but it needed someone to wield it. But there was one thing he didn't know about Louise. In the last months, while pretending to be his obedient victim, she had learned something important. Sometimes, when you have nothing to lose, you become dangerous in ways no one expects. "Maybe you're right," Louise said, backing toward the window, her mind working feverishly. "Maybe no one will believe me here in Holland." Confusion passed through his eyes, a crack in his facade of control. "But," Louise continued, her voice gaining strength, "I bet they'll believe me in other cities, in the state capital, in Chicago newspapers, on television." And then Louise did something he never expected. With a force that came from desperation and anger, she broke the window with a chair, the glass shattering with a deafening sound, and jumped. The fall was only one floor, but Louise felt as if she had jumped from a cliff, the air whipping her face. She landed badly on the grass, twisting her ankle and tearing her nightgown on Mrs. McKenna's rose bushes. But she was out. She was free. And she had in her hands the evidence that would destroy them all. Louise ran down the dark street, limping, the bag pressed against her chest, with the Reverend's furious screams echoing behind her, mixing with the barking of dogs that began to light up in the houses. Little Holland was waking up to what would be its last day of peaceful sleep, the prelude to a storm of truth and justice. Holland's bus station was little more than a wooden platform with a bench and a faded sign. It was 5 in the morning, and Louise had been there for 3 hours, hiding behind Mr. Peterson's tool shed, waiting for the first bus to the state capitol. The cold of Michigan's dawn penetrated her bones, and every minute seemed like an eternity. Her ankle was swollen and throbbed with every heartbeat, a constant pain that reminded her of the desperate escape. The torn nightgown barely protected her from the cold, and she was sure she looked exactly like what she was, a desperate fugitive with tangled hair and a dirty face. But she had the evidence, and that made everything worthwhile, every pain, every fear. While waiting, Louise mentally reviewed everything she had discovered. It wasn't just Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell and some isolated accomplices. It was a network, a systematic operation that involved city authorities, respected businessmen, and even some families she considered decent, the rot extending far beyond what she had imagined. The notebook listed names of girls who had disappeared over the years. Some Louise recognized. They were girls who supposedly had run away or found work in other cities. Others were completely unknown to her, probably from other orphanages or neighboring cities, all victims of a cruel system. There were also codes and numbers that initially didn't make sense, but now Louise understood. They were prices, preferred ages, most requested physical types. It was a human catalog, and the bureaucratic coldness of those records made her feel nauseous, a deep revulsion at the depravity. The sound of tires on the road made her get up, her heart racing again. It was them. A line of black cars was coming down Main Street toward the station. Even in the dawn's penumbra, Louise could see the silhouettes inside the vehicles. Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell was in the first car, along with Sheriff Johnson, their faces somber and determined. They had guessed where she would be. Louise's heart raced. The bus wouldn't arrive for another 15 minutes, and there was nowhere to run. The tool shed had only one door, and they were already surrounding the area, closing the circle. Despair threatened to swallow her. It was then she heard the voice. Psst, here. It was Mrs. Eleanor McKenna, the Reverend's neighbor, calling her from behind a bush near the road. Eleanor was a lady of almost 70, widowed for decades, known in town for feeding stray cats and making the best cookies in all of Holland. Louise had never exchanged more than polite greetings with her. "Come, dear, quick." Eleanor's voice was urgent but calm. Louise had no choice. She ran to her, limping, still holding the bag tight against her chest, hope lighting a small flame inside her. "I saw you jump from the window," Eleanor whispered, pulling Louise behind the bushes, her eyes full of painful understanding. "I saw them looking for you. I know what's happening." "Ma'am, Shh." Eleanor put a finger to her lips, silencing Louise. "My granddaughter Sarah also went through this, 5 years ago. She was only 15 when the Reverend helped her find work in Chicago." Tears shone in her eyes, an old and fresh pain at the same time. "We never saw her again." Louise's heart broke. Sarah McKenna. She remembered her, a sweet blonde-haired girl who always smiled. Her family had said she had gotten a job in a rich house in the big city. "She's on the list," Louise murmured, remembering the name in the notebook, the connection forming in her mind. "I always knew," Eleanor continued, her voice laden with years of repressed pain and helplessness. "I always knew something was wrong. But who would believe an old woman against the man of God?" The cars stopped at the station. Men began getting out, spreading through the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Louise heard the sheriff's voice ordering them to check all possible hiding places. "Come," Eleanor pulled Louise, her determination unshakable. "I have a car." "I can't involve you in this, ma'am. Dear," Eleanor interrupted her, and her voice had a firmness Louise had never heard before, a strength that surprised her. "They already involved me when they took my Sarah. Now it's time to settle accounts." They ran, crouched, through the back of houses until they reached Mrs. McKenna's garage. She had an old but well-maintained Ford, an unexpected refuge. They got in, and Eleanor started the engine with the efficiency of someone who had planned that moment for years, revenge and justice pulsing in her veins. "Where to?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the road. "State Capitol. I need to reach the newspapers, state authorities," Louise replied, her voice full of new hope. "Then that's where we're going." As they left Holland by secondary roads, Louise spent the next 20 minutes telling Eleanor everything. She showed her the photographs, the letters, the records. She saw Eleanor's jaw harden with each revelation. Her hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, pain and anger transforming into cold determination. "How many girls?" Eleanor murmured, her voice choked. "My God, how many girls?" "We're going to stop them," Louise said, her voice full of conviction. "We're going to make them pay for everything." "Yes," Eleanor replied, and there was something fierce in her voice, a promise of justice. "We will." But what neither of them knew was that their journey was just beginning. What they would discover in the Capitol would change everything they thought they knew about the extent of that corruption, and it would almost cost them their lives. 66 years after that fateful night, the town of Holland, Michigan, woke up to a reality many preferred to ignore. The local newspaper blazoned on the front page, "Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell, accused of child abuse. Investigation reveals network of silence." The news reverberated throughout the community, breaking decades of silence and complicity. Louise Carter sat in the front row of the courtroom, her hands trembling slightly as she held the testimony she had written and rewritten dozens of times. At 68, she was finally ready to tell the truth she had carried for more than 5 decades, a truth that had consumed her from within. Eleanor McKenna was beside her, her presence firm like an anchor amid the storm of emotions. In recent months, Eleanor had become more than an ally. She was the sister Louise never had, the family she chose. Eleanor's modest house had become her refuge, and together they had worked tirelessly to build a solid case against Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell and his accomplices. "Are you ready, dear?" Eleanor whispered, squeezing Louise's hand, a gesture of silent support. Louise looked at the defendant's bench, where Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell sat, visibly aged and diminished. His hair, once merely graying, was now completely white. His hands, which once caused her so much terror, trembled slightly. But his eyes still carried that calculating coldness Louise knew so well, a gleam of evil unchanged by time. "I'm ready," Louise replied, and for the first time in decades, she really believed it, feeling a strength reborn within her. The prosecutor, a young and determined man named James Morrison, had sought them out after the newspaper story came out. The photographs and documents Louise had collected, along with testimonies from other victims who began speaking out after Louise's courage, had built an irrefutable case. The network of silence was beginning to crumble. "Mrs. Louise Carter," the judge called her, his voice echoing in the courtroom. "Are you ready to give your testimony?" Louise rose slowly, feeling the weight of 53 years of silence lifting from her shoulders, a gradual liberation. She walked to the witness stand, swore to tell the truth, and began to speak. Her voice, initially tremulous, gained strength with each word, filling the courtroom with the story of her pain and resilience. Louise told about that first night, about the years of abuse, about the forced pregnancy, about the baby that was taken from her. She told about the fear, about the isolation, about how Holland's own community that should have protected her had silenced her. She narrated the details of the notebook, the photos, the newspaper clippings, the coldness of the trafficking network, the complicity of Sheriff Johnson, Judge McCarty, and Mayor Wilson, exposing the rot that hid beneath the facade of respectability. Throughout her testimony, Louise never took her eyes off Reverend Jeremiah Caldwell. She wanted him to know she was no longer that terrified 15-year-old girl. She was a woman who had found her voice and would no longer be silenced, an unshakable force. When she finished, the silence in the courtroom was deafening, heavy with emotion. Several people on the jury were crying, their faces contorted with pain and empathy. Some women in the gallery looked at Louise with recognition. She recognized in them the same look she had carried for so many years, a bond of suffering and hope. The defense attorney tried to discredit her, questioning why she had waited so long to speak, suggesting she was making up stories to make money. But Louise was prepared. She had spent months preparing for this moment, anticipating every attack. "Sir," Louise replied firmly, her voice resonating with conviction, "when you're a child and the entire community tells you that what happened was your fault, when you're forced to marry a man who treats you like property, when every institution that should protect you turns its back, you learn that your word is worthless. It took me 53 years to find my voice. I won't."
In that cold and colorless home, where faith was used to wound and not to warm, a girl with cloudy skies in her eyes learned to smile in silence, where the darkness lies. They wove a veil upon her childhood days, called her a saint, but locked the windows grace. She dreamed of tulips dancing in the breeze, but only saw the shadows grit that wouldn't cease. But deep inside, a fire burned bright. She mapped a new game, hidden from in heaven's domain. Outside, the town slept blind to the truth, while the silence bled away the proof. But you kept each trace like a flower